Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the John Adams Institute, hosted by Pakhuis de Zwijger. My name is Tracy Metz. I'm the director of the John Adams and journalist and an author. Our guest of this evening, Jeremy Bailenson, welcome Jeremy, is a psychologist and a professor of communication at Stanford and the founding director of the Virtual Human Interaction Lab. We are very happy to welcome him to the John Adams Institute to talk about his experience with and his expectations of virtual reality, which he writes about in his new book, which you can also see on the screen, of course, What Would Life This Evening Be Without Screens? Ooh. Hang on. Yes. To talk about his new book, Experience on Demand, what virtual reality is, how it works, and what it can do. How many of you are involved in VR in some professional capacity? Wonderful. And how many of you came this evening hoping to finally figure out what all the fuss is about? Jeremy, it's pretty even, actually, our audience this evening. Well, the fact that you're here shows that you know that VR is hot and has been for quite a while already. Here in Amsterdam, we have the yearly VR Days coming up in October, and Bailenson himself has witnessed the shift of VR from the laboratory to the Christmas tree. Although he does honestly admit that a lot of people's responses when they open their present is, what am I supposed to do with this? One of the many delightful factoids in his book is that in the 3 days around Christmas of 2016, the use of the Google search term VR content tripled. And, by the way, so did queries for VR porn. I'm hoping to learn this evening whether that content is already out there. I had thought that my first, I remember vividly my own first VR experience. I had thought it might be something deep, like my first kiss, or the first time I saw a dead person. But to tell you the truth, I was distinctly underwhelmed. I put the goggles on, and what I saw were neon-colored objects dancing around in a room with no walls. I was more impressed the next time when, with a push of a button on the controls that I was holding, I was able to jump onto a table with no effort at all. But at the same time, I thought, okay, so... After reading Bailenson's book, I have a much better idea of the answer to the question, so... He shows through his own 20 years of experience how VR can basically change our lives because it is an immersive experience. The key word is immersive. It can help us learn new things like playing golf or flying a plane. It can help us do what we do better, like making a split-second decision on our next move in a football game. It can liberate us from trauma, as some of the moving stories that he tells of people who lived through the 9/11 attacks show. It can help us understand climate change and how it is linked to our own personal behavior. And by putting us in a cow simulator, yes, a cow simulator, it can help us understand animal suffering and perhaps stimulate us to eat less meat. And it can evoke empathy. It is, in brief, amazing and potentially life and world changing. Before I give the floor to our guest of honor this evening, I have to tell you that we're on a very tight schedule. There's an event right after us this evening, and so we have to stop at 7:30 and exit the hall as soon as possible. Sorry, but that's the way it is. And I'll come back to you after Jeremy's talk and my interview with him, questions from yourself, and some closing remarks. So now I would like to say, Jeremy Bailenson, I'm glad that you're here to tell us about this fascinating technology.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you for having me. Thank you for that very thoughtful and well-researched introduction. I don't often get those, and I appreciate the due diligence and the thoughtfulness of it. So, my PhD is in cognitive psychology. In 1999, my dissertation was on using computers to simulate reasoning and categorization and vision of the brain. In 1999, I switched fields. I left cognitive science, and I decided to pursue a career building immersive virtual reality from a hardware standpoint, programming the content, and running psychology experiments to understand what happens to the brain when people go inside of immersive virtual reality. So I'm thrilled to be here tonight because when we asked how many of you guys are working in VR, imagine me in 1999, you said, Jeremy, what do you do for a living? And I say, well, I build VR and I test to see what it does to your brain. You quickly walk away from me, right? But now half of you are working in VR and all of you fought traffic to come see me tonight, and I very much appreciate that. The key to virtual reality is called presence. So what you're seeing here is a screenshot from one of our classic demonstrations. In the year 2001, I flew to Washington, D.C., and for the US government, we hosted a conference on using virtual reality in the courtroom. We were teaching about recreating crime scenes for investigators, or to have witnesses look around at suspects to do police lineups. And our classic demo is called Walking the Plank. And what you see there is somebody puts on the goggles, and the room looks just like the physical room, but we drop a chasm. The chasm's about 10 meters deep, and it's about 3 meters to get across, and we put a very rickety plank over, and you just have to walk across that plank. In 2001, we had a federal judge. He was about 65 years old. He was a very big man, and when he was walking the plank, he just by accident stepped a little bit to the left. Of course, we model gravity, and so he saw the world rush down to him visually as he fell down that plank, and he heard the whoosh of the wind. If you're in the physical world and you fell down that plank, how would you save your life? You would dive at a 45-degree angle, okay? And so this federal judge in the middle of a room of 500 lawyers just dove, okay? It gets worse. This is my first public demo ever, and my computer was sitting on a table with a very sharp corner, okay? And the federal judge's face was going right to that corner. My one move, I was a 26-year-old postdoc, was to smash into him to change his directory so his face, so he was fine. Did he sue you? I didn't go to jail. I didn't get sued. But the point of this, why I waste 3 valuable minutes in this talk to give you that story is, it's called presence. Presence, as defined by psychologists, is the illusion of non-mediation, meaning when VR is done well, there's no goggles, there's no pixels, there's no field of view, you're just having an experience. And what I'm trying to convince you today, if there's one lesson to take from my talk, when VR is done well, and it's often not done well, when it's done well, the brain treats it as a real experience, not a media experience. This is my lab at Stanford. It's considered by most to be the most immersive VR lab from a technological standpoint. It's a very accurate system to track your body. We have a floor that shakes up and down to move your legs. 24 speakers in the walls move sound around. We have virtual scent. We have visit from heads of state, the US military, from astronauts. But now that I've bragged about my lab, let me tell you that my lab is becoming obsolete from a technological standpoint. So the goggles on the right, if you read the book, 2/3 of the publications of the experiments from that book are using the 2 goggles on the right. Each one costs more than my car. Okay, I drive a Ford, so that's maybe not saying much, but each one is $30,000, $40,000. The ones we use today, they cost 150 euros, 100 euros, depending on the type. When I first started this work, there was about 500, maybe 1,000 goggles in the world. Now, in the US alone, there's north of 15 million pairs. So we're at a very special time. But those of you that have tried virtual reality have probably had the same reaction as my grandfather. He was 90. He's 92 now. He was 90 when I put him in virtual reality. And he looked around and he said, this is pretty cool, but really, what's the point? Okay? In my opinion, VR is done well when you leverage a paradox. The brain treats it as real, but the rules go away. You can turn physics on and off. You can change your body. You can go backward in time. You can grow a third arm. There are no rules. So I'm going to go over a number of applications that leverage this paradox, that you can do anything, but the brain has not yet evolved, because VR is very new, to know it's not real. I want to briefly talk about downsides. We can talk more in the Q&A, but the book has been reviewed by the New York Times and by Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal. And the critique that's common is, Bailenson, you're way too much of an optimist. You're talking about all these great applications, but we should talk about distraction. People can't even walk without texting, and now that they're going to be wearing goggles, will they smash into cars and fall off of cliffs? We can talk about addiction. When social media feels like the best party you've ever been to, when pornography feels like sex, how does society function? Simulator sickness, when VR is done badly, you get a little bit dizzy. Modeling bad behavior, I just wrote a piece for CNN that you can all read about. Virtual reality first-person shooter games actually give you the muscle memory on how to learn how to do violence, how to succeed at violence. And kids are very special. So here's a video of a girl meeting Grover.
Okay, ready? Oh, hello there! It's Design, your lovable furry friend Grover. Hi. Get up out of your chair and dance with us. Follow our crazy moves. You can do it. Okay.
All right.
So we just published and is free online a report from Common Sense Media that is everything we know about VR and kids. The good news is that we've run now hundreds of kids who are 3 years old, 4 years old, and 5 years old through our studies, and no one's gotten hurt, no one's gotten dizzy, there haven't been nightmares, so that's the good news. They're in VR for about 4 minutes meeting Grover from Sesame Street. So the bad news, or the cautionary news, is that VR is much more influential than other media. So if you're asking a child to do something, if Grover, the character, asks, the probability that the child will do something, walk up and dance, or share stickers, increases when you meet the character in VR compared to when you meet them on television. So, given that there are some downsides to VR, as a person whose job it is to talk to decision makers and to help steer a little bit people's decisions on use, here's my set of standards. I believe we should save virtual reality for experiences that, if you did them in the physical world, would be impossible, really rare or expensive, dangerous, or counterproductive. And I'm going to go over each of these individually. Another way of saying this is that in 5 years from now, if you guys are putting on the goggles to check your email, then I've done something wrong, okay? So let's talk about the impossible. I want to talk about empathy. In the year 2003, we built the virtual mirror. And the virtual mirror allows you to walk in someone else's shoes. It leverages two theories. The first one is called the contact hypothesis. In the United States in the 1960s, when schools were segregated, a sociologist suggested if you take whites and blacks and put them together, that social contact will help them get along. The second theory is called body transfer. And this is a neuroscience theory that basically says when you move physically and you see a virtual avatar move with you, meaning if you move your arm in the first person, you see an arm move, and in a mirror you see the arm move, then that causes the brain to treat that mirror image, that virtual avatar, as you. In other words, the brain expands to include this representation as a part of the body. And I'm going to show you a movie that's 15 years old, and it's about teaching people diversity and tolerance about race and gender. So he's walking around, and again, excuse the graphics there. I like to show history here. He walks up to the mirror. In the experiment, he moves around for about 4 minutes. You're only seeing it for 10 seconds here. He moves his head moves with him. He turns his body, the body moves. He does this for 4 minutes. It really feels like it's you in the mirror. He bends down, I hit a button. He comes up, and now he's a woman of color, okay? And the next phase is I network a second person into virtual reality, and I walk up and I see I'm a woman of color. That person then proceeds to treat me horribly, to say terrible things about my race, about my gender, and perhaps even physically assault me. And I experience firsthand prejudice. And what we've been studying for 15 years is how this experience of walking in someone else's shoes changes the way you behave. To give an example of a study, this is a recent one we published where half the subjects imagined they role-played that they were visually impaired. The other half became impaired. We used the goggles to make it so they couldn't see well, and they had to do a very difficult sorting task. We never trust self-report. We never ask people, are you going to help? We always look at behavior. everyone in this room wants to be more helpful, wants to be better towards others. It's not easy to always change your behavior. In this study, after the experiment, we gave them the opportunity to help others. We literally, after the study, they were paid. We gave them an opportunity to volunteer for free. People who became impaired in VR spend twice as much time volunteering to help others as those that role play. So showing changes in behavior is part of the work that we do. The neat part of my job now, because the goggles have gotten so cheap, we can work with companies and governments and scale this work out. So what you're looking at is an interview simulator that we've built for a number of companies, international companies. And the idea is all of us in this room have been interviewed. Many of us have conducted interviews, and it turns out that we're biased when we do interviews. And the way we look at women is different from the way we look at men. The way that the questions we ask are different based on your age. And all of us, humans, are biased, and we know this. The problem with a lot of diversity training is it basically often ends with, okay, you're biased, now go home and think about that and be sad. What we've built is an interview simulator that lets you practice interviews. And you can interview someone who's white, who's black, who's Asian, who's Hispanic, who is 70 years old, 50 years old. You do the interview, then you experience the interview from the other side. You get your own actions replayed and feel what it's like to be interviewed, and you get to repeat this process and learn about what you've done wrong, and then you get to redo it with practice. And there's a number of companies that are using this. It's excellent. I just came from the Tribeca Film Festival in New York City, where there is an arcade where thousands of people are going through, and we've premiered a number of pieces. One of them that just premiered is called Becoming Homeless, and it puts you in the shoes of a homeless person. The reason I bring this one up is it is the largest VR study in history. Thousands of people have gone through, and what we've shown is that when you become homeless and you go through the process of losing your home and feel what that's like as you're trying to live in your car and get rousted by people harassing you, we later, when the goggles are off, we hand you a petition. And we say, are you willing to have your own personal taxes increased to support more affordable housing? And the probability of signing that petition increases when you've done this experience with thousands of people feeding into this data set compared to many control conditions. All right, so that's impossible, changing who you are. Now I'm going to go to things that are counterproductive. And these are things that if you were to do them in the real world, you would learn an important lesson, but it would come at a cost. So I don't know if they have this in the Netherlands. In the United States in the 1970s, there's a practice. A father would catch his young son smoking a cigarette, and then he'd stick him in the closet and force him to smoke an entire carton to teach him a lesson that smoking is bad for you. And so you learn a lesson, but it comes at a cost to your lungs. And what I want to talk about today is conservation. So this is a quote from a woman named Dr. Jane Lubchenco. Dr. Lubchenco was the head of the United States National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration for 4 years. In that 4-year window, she saw more natural disaster, floods, droughts, tornadoes, hurricanes than any 4-year window in U.S. history. Of course, scientists know that the frequency and the extremeness of these events is due to climate change. However, in the United States, many lawmakers, including our president, and many citizens do not believe in climate change. So how do you get them to understand how pressing this issue is? This quote from Dr. Lubchenco, her job as a government official was to travel to places that got hurt by disaster. And this is a quote about her describing an interaction with a lawmaker that I won't name in the United States. He was a very vocal climate change denier. When his district got ravaged by natural disaster, he looked at her when she got off the helicopter and he said, I have become a believer. I have seen the light. And what Dr. Lubchenco says is when you have a firsthand experience with climate change, all of a sudden you believe the threats are real. In virtual reality, natural disaster is free, okay? You hit a button, it happens, and nobody gets hurt. So the first study we ever ran was based on an article written by Leslie Kaufman for the New York Times in the year 2009. And this article said if you use this soft, fluffy toilet paper that we all love, it turns out the pulp that toilet paper is made from is not recycled. And 50% of that pulp in the United States comes from second growth forest. 10% comes from virgin trees, much of it along the coast of Western Canada. So we are deforesting currently for a task that's probably not all that important, to use fluffy toilet paper. In the United States, this article comes out in 2009, and where I live in San Francisco, it's the hippiest, greenest, crunchiest place in the United States, but many stores don't sell recycled toilet paper. How do you change people's behavior? And so an early study we ran, all subjects got the statistics I just gave you. We then had one group that read a beautifully written narrative of what it's like to cut down a tree. The second group saw a video shot from the shoulder of a lumberjack. The third group put on the goggles, and they had a haptic device, a virtual touch device that shook their hands, and they were forced to cut down 2 trees. When the trees fell, boom, it shook their legs, and the floor of the lab bounced up, and really intense experience. And I get phone calls from people in the lab. They say, Jeremy, I went to the supermarket yesterday, and I went down the toilet paper aisle, and I thought about you, okay? And while I like that, that's the idea, that's what we're after. Again, we never trust self-report. In this experiment, we had 2 conditions, 2 things we measured. First, we measured before and after whether they said they were going to use less paper, their intention to recycle. All 3 groups, whether they read the narrative, saw the video, or cut down the tree in VR, they all said they were going to use less paper. Only the VR group reduced their paper use later on, and that was by 20%. So having this experience of cutting down the tree, using your body, really changes behavior and forces you to conserve more. Now, if I were to teach you about deforestation by forcing you to cut down actual trees, it'd be a really bad way to teach it. VR gives you the best of both worlds. The brain treats it as real, but you're not harming the environment. One of the things I'm most proud of from the last decade is we spent 3 years and thousands of hours building a 7-minute field trip to teach about how climate change is going to affect the ocean via ocean acidification. So we built it, and it took many, many years. It's an amazing journey where you're walking around and you're examining species, and you fast forward in time, and you see how the chemistry changes the entire food web. And the first thing we've done is we've tested this. We've put it in high school classrooms and colleges, and we know that people learn. But there's motivation. If we go to, say, a festival, and we set up a booth that says, learn about the chemistry of the ocean, we have a line of 100 people, and each one waits an hour all day long for days on end. And I've done this a number of times. People will wait online to learn about chemistry if it's done in virtual reality because it's fun. I've done a number of things with policy. So we've done a briefing at the US Senate where we have taken senators, congresswomen, and congressmen and shown them virtual reality experiences to help inform policy. It didn't do much in the United States in terms of climate change policy, but we are trying. But what I'm most proud of now is that we put this up, as well as everything we do in the lab, for free on a place called Steam, as well as Viveport, as well as Oculus Share. You can download it for free, and if you have the HTC Vive or the Oculus Rift, which costs a couple $100, you can do this too. Okay, I want to shift now to experiences that are expensive and rare. So this tends to fall in a lot of the category, using VR for things that if you did it in the real world would be really, really expensive. And I want to begin talking about sports, and then I will port that over to business. I know that American football does not translate that well to many places, but Derek Belch was a graduate student in my lab in 2013, and his master's thesis was to build a trainer for the quarterback in American football. So the quarterback, he goes to the line of scrimmage, and he has about 5 seconds to look, recognize what the defense is doing. They're all running around trying to distract him, make a decision to keep the original play or change to a different play, and then communicate that decision to the rest of the team so they can adjust. So look around for a pattern, make a decision, tell your teammates about it. So what we did is we built a simulator to teach our quarterbacks about complicated plays. After 3 weeks, it was working so well that the coach at Stanford University, the football team, made it mandatory. And that season, the coach David Shaw, as well as the quarterback Kevin Hogan, will both attribute part of their success to using this technology. We outperformed expectations, and they claim that extra mental repetition, because we didn't take away practice on the field, the extra practice of just doing it over and over again, of feeling like you were there and getting that extra practice, changed the way that they performed. So Derek Belch, my student, graduates January 2nd in the year 2015. Like many Stanford undergraduates, the next day he forms a company, forms a startup. Okay, it's called Striver, and that 3 months later, to everybody's surprise, he has signed 5 or 6 large NFL National Football League teams to multi-year contracts, and he's literally now changing the way that sports is trained, not only in the United States. We have not worked with any Dutch teams yet, but we're working with the German national soccer team, and there's a lot of success that's being done. However, it turns out that process I described, which is look around, recognize a pattern, and make a decision, and then tell others about it, is pretty much describes all of our day jobs, okay? And what was shocking to me to watch this company grow was what happened when somebody from Walmart, big retail company, came and tried it out and said, I think this works pretty well for retail. And, you talk about walking the plank. There's something called Holiday Rush, Black Friday in the United States. It's this most crowded day for shopping. To me, Holiday Rush as a Walmart employee is more terrifying than walking the plank. Everybody's yelling at you and in your space. It's really intense. And with Walmart, Walmart has 200 training academies. The new CEO of Walmart decided if you work there, at any time you should be able to get in your car and drive to a training academy to get better. Okay, you go there for about a week for a boot camp where you learn all sorts of things about Walmart. We started in one of their training academies, and we use VR to teach them about how to do their job, whether it's Holiday Rush or detecting safety hazards or having a difficult conversation with a customer. So when we went into one, after a few months, we saw that they liked it and it was working. So we then went to 30 of them, and we'd had 30 academies use VR, and we paired it with 30 other ones who were similar, who hadn't used VR, and we showed quantitatively that people did better on their job subsequently when they got the VR training. We are now in all 200 of the Walmart training academies, and in the history of VR, remember I've been doing this for 20 years, I truly believe this is the example of the democratization of VR. Literally, in the last 12 months, 200,000 Walmart employees have put on the goggles and done better at their job and learned how to train it. And it's a really neat moment in history. I want to conclude with an example of using VR to do things in the physical world that would be dangerous, okay? And why do we have virtual reality? One reason is because of the flight simulator, okay? In 1929, Edwin Link decided, I want to learn how to fly. I don't want to do it from a book, because the way we learn is by doing, and then we make mistakes, and we get feedback on those mistakes, and we iterate. And of course, if you're flying a plane, that process is very expensive, hence the simulator. And of course, the military has been training in VR for so long as there's been virtual reality. But I want to talk about an extremely dangerous behavior that we all do every day, and it's called driving. Okay. In the United States, you mentioned 9/11, Tracy. That year, almost 10 times as many people in the United States were killed by car accidents than they were by terrorists. Driving is a horribly dangerous thing. I want us to go back. You know when you watch a movie from the 1970s and there's a doctor talking to a patient, and there's a pregnant woman in the chair and the doctor's smoking, blowing on the pregnant woman, and you kind of laugh and you say, can you believe we ever did that? I want us to think about the commute to work. And I know, look, in the Netherlands, you guys are much better than us. You take public transportation, and you cycle a lot more. In the United States, everybody drives. Everybody gets in this metal box. They get behind a bunch of other people in the metal boxes, and for an hour, they yell at each other, and they lose productivity. They get stressed out. Or you take public transportation, and you get germs, and I'm not trying to reduce face-to-face contact. What I am saying is that so many of us commute an hour to work, sit at a desk, pound on a computer, make a phone call, and then go home. And if I can cut that commute by half, we've just solved climate change, or maybe by 3/5, we've just solved climate change if you do the math. However, the reason we go to work is because video conferencing just isn't good enough, right? If you have to have a meeting with someone, you want to have that nonverbal contact. You want to be able to see a sidelong glance. You want to have this social presence that you guys have with me right now. So for 20 years, I've dedicated at least half of my working hours to building in the infrastructure in virtual reality that allows you to have this magic social presence, things like eye contact and the virtual handshake where you feel a little bit of touch, and we're crawling along and getting closer. But I truly believe, people say, what is the best use case of VR? And I like everything I've talked about, but wow, if we can get it so that half of travel, I still want you to travel to the party. I want you to travel to nature. I don't want you, I literally flew 30 hours from California to Borneo to give a 45-minute talk about using VR to help climate change. And then I flew back, okay? And something's got to give. When the planet becomes 11 billion people, we can't be driving all over the place. And I truly believe, and I'm happy to talk more about this, the companies in Silicon Valley that are springing up these, what's called social VR, we're really getting closer. There was a Supreme Court case in 2011 in the United States, and California had ruled that when kids are buying violent video games, that there needs to be a rating system based on their age. The US Supreme Court, the entire national US Supreme Court, overruled California and said, violent video games are free speech, they are protected, and you cannot regulate. I believe in free speech. One US Supreme Court Justice Alito, wrote a concurring opinion, which means he agreed with the majority that violent video games are free speech, but he put a little asterisk there. And what he said, this is back in 2011, as video games get more immersive and more realistic, we need to reconsider this. And I once got a lot of hate mail from video gamers because what I'm about to say got edited out of a BBC piece. I truly believe in free speech, and I do not want to regulate their content. But when friends and family ask me, they say, Jeremy, how should I think about what to do in VR? My answer to them is, for my family and my friends, VR was designed to do things you can't do in the real world. That's why it's there. However, if there is an activity that if you did it in the real world, that night when you went to the mirror, you would kind of cringe looking at yourself, or you couldn't kiss your spouse after doing it, it's probably not the kind of thing you want to do in VR. It's probably not the kind of thing you want to do in VR, because what our research shows is that VR, it's not a media experience. You're using your body to do this stuff, and the motor neurons and the motor sensory cortex gets activated. It's not the type of thing that you should be doing if you're not comfortable with it. So I can't wait for our conversation, and I really appreciate what an attentive crowd you've been during this lecture, and now we can chat. Thank you.
Thank you for this fascinating talk, Jeremy. I've been looking forward to your visit really ever since we knew you were coming, because this is such an exciting frontier of technology. But there's also been a lot of not so good publicity about technology these days. And I wanted to ask you about a couple of the ethical aspects of VR. Your first book, Infinite Reality, was about what we could do in VR, and this one, Experience on Demand, is more about what we should do, more about the ethical aspects. And you said we shouldn't do things in VR that we wouldn't want to do in real life. We don't want to train terrorists, for example. What impediments are there to VR being used for exactly this kind of goals? And the game industry, which you mentioned, doesn't seem to have any qualms about this.
So I just had a huge event at Stanford where I had the former commissioner of the Federal Communications Committee, the FCC of the United States, whose job it is to think about how to regulate media. And I had, I'm not going to name companies, but in terms of the big companies producing VR, I had most of their C-suite there. And we had a discussion about who is going to regulate content. And what the government said for the US is, well, it doesn't go through the airwaves, because it goes through the pipes, the optic cables. Companies own the optic cable, so it's not a public good, so the government's not going to touch it. Oh. And what the tech company said is that we're just a platform. So what I wrote...
I know nothing.
I know nothing. So I wrote this piece for CNN that came out 2 weeks ago that literally got me more than 1,000 frothing hate emails each day. And here was my suggestion for the violence. It was, I don't want to regulate your content and I want you to have your games, but what if we did, as a community, we agreed on 3 standards for all really violent video games in VR. Number 1, bullets don't go straight, okay? They're curved. So if I want to shoot a target in VR, I have to aim up or to the side. And so the skills that I'm learning, you're going to learn some skills that don't generalize. The second is, let's shoot objects in VR not like this. Let's make the option, the motor action abstract. Twitch your elbow. And that's how the bullets go. The third one is, if you're shooting things in VR, they shouldn't be people. They should be robots or aliens that are shaped differently than people and that move in really weird, quirky ways so that your trajectory leading doesn't generalize. So still make amazing, fun games, but just make it a little, the transfer will be a little less available.
Yeah. And what was the reaction?
1,000 hate mails per day. And the problem is, as you mentioned, in this climate right now, the problem with social media is that there was a good discussion by people who had actually read the article, but the problem is that people were reading 3-line snippets that others were pulling out, and as the game of telephone went on, it was, I was trying to, suppress free speech.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And what do you, okay, government's not going to regulate it, the tech companies say, well, it's not our fault. What would be the ideal solution, do you feel? Do you think this is something government should take on?
Well, it's going to depend on which government we're talking about. I'm not familiar as much with how the Dutch government works. To be honest, I don't even know how our government works in this context. When the FCC chairman said it's not our job because it doesn't go through the air, nothing goes through the air anymore. Right? Look, I'm a firm believer in free speech, and I want it to be out there. Here's what I can tell you. In my lab, when we have really violent content, because we download some games just so people can experience what it's like, people don't want to do it. I know that sounds very altruistic and hippie of me. Like, I myself like to watch zombie movies. When I do VR and the way that you're grabbing the zombies...
I thought you'd be a vampire guy.
Fair enough. I don't know how to answer that question, but sure. There's something different about doing versus watching. And I truly believe the reason why the video game market is so successful now is you can kill vampires or zombies for 10 hours straight doing this and still be a fundamentally good person for the most part. When you're using your hands to do it and the way that you're punching somebody is by you're feeling haptics and the blood splat. I think it's different, and it's my hope. I know you wanted a more, controversial answer. It's my hope that just people don't want to do it. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But that's
because it is so immersive, perhaps.
Because it's immersive, and it's just not. It doesn't feel good.
Yeah. On the other hand, the beheading videos on YouTube have also been disgustingly popular.
If it bleeds, it leads, right?
Yeah, sex sells. Another ethical aspect that you mentioned, and then I want to say, I'd like to go straight to you with questions. I have a million, but I'm sure you do too. And this is your evening, so we have 2 people with microphones. If they'll come stand at the front of the hall so they can see you, then please jump right in. The other ethical question that I wanted to put to you right away is, at some point in the book you say, it is likely addictive. And we've seen how unbelievably addictive even your phone can be, which is not nearly as immersive as VR. Is there a solution to that?
So I didn't pull out my phone while we were talking. Aren't you impressed? My hand went to my pocket like 3 times, right?
I'm flattered, thank you.
No, yeah, it's horrifying how addicted we are to our smartphones. It's just, it keeps me up at night. The good thing about VR, and this is one of the problems with something called augmented reality, which we can talk about if we want. The good thing about VR is that it's so intense, and you got to wear these goggles, and you sweat a little bit, and you can't see the real world. It doesn't really, you don't want to do it for hours on end. It's good for these kind of 20-minute bursts is what we talk about in the book. And now as the goggles get lighter, you're going to be able to wear them for longer and longer. I don't have solutions to you, and I share your concerns. It's something that I think we should talk about and continue to brainstorm on. But what we say in this Common Sense Medium report for families, the key, the two phrases to pull out is moderation, let your kids use it not too much, and supervision. You want to be there in the world, not just to make sure they're not doing horrible content, but to make sure they don't smash into walls or step on the cat. We had our first death. The field of virtual reality in Moscow, a man was playing a video game, fell through a plate glass table and bled to death. And it's horrible and tragic. I'm actually surprised that we've only heard of one of these.
Yeah. One more ethical question before we go to the audience. You mentioned the issue of homelessness and how VR can create empathy, really putting us in the shoes of a homeless person, for example, and then you hit them with a petition.
Yes.
This could also easily be used for other less sympathetic political outcomes or petitions. Is there the issue of abuse, either of users' data or, for example, of abuse of the experience, is really, to me, a very present danger.
Absolutely. I put an exclamation point on it, and yes. I can't look you in the eye and say VR is so powerful it's going to make us less racist, and not claim that if you gave somebody inflammatory experiences that it wouldn't cause the same thing. So it's certainly, technology works for good and evil, and I don't, as a guy that is trying to not regulate free speech, we just have to, grassroots community standards, be active.
Simple human decency.
Let's hope.
With hoping we still have that somewhere.
Inshallah.
Yeah, inshallah. Okay, yours. Yes. This gentleman right here first. Could you stand up and say your name, please? Hi.
Hello, my name is Michel Dieben. I'm a medical doctor. I work at the Leiden University Medical Center. And I basically do just the opposite that we just discussed. I try to train doctors to treat their patients in a better way. And right now, what I'm struggling a little bit with is VR really better in the sense of educating people? Because right now we have a really strong wow factor in everything, and I try to point through it, and I have a follow-up question after that.
Okay, so first of all, I completely agree on the wow factor, and when students pitch me ideas and companies pitch me ideas, if you give me 20 ideas, I will say 19 of them are done better with the video or the written word than VR. Let's save VR for the things that make it special, and I'm happy to go into that. And Chapter 10 is all about the standards that you do to make good VR. There's a guy named David Gaba at Stanford. He's a medical doctor, and we spent dozens of hours trying to brainstorm on, when it comes to a doctor talking to a patient, what can't you do with an actor, a simulated patient? And one thing we came upon was people that have facial disfigurement. For example, if you don't have a jaw, that's really hard to do with makeup or with an actor. That was one of them. We just built something, you can find this online, a Project Braveheart. This is for kids who are going into surgery for heart surgery. And what we gave them is they put on the goggles and they got to tour the waiting room, meet their anesthesiologist, go to where they were, just to get that tour, because hospitals are so crowded they can't get it. And then in the midst of it, they learn things like paced breathing exercises while they're in a VR version of their exact waiting room. And it was, to me, that felt like it justified. So I agree that training works quite well right now. The two reasons you'd use VR for the things other than I described would be for consistency. You get the exact same experience, a digital thing, you replicate 1 billion copies, and for cost. Assuming the goggles cost $100 and you can't hire the best person that's out there.
Okay, thank you. And
Can we come back to you later for the next question?
Okay, that's excellent.
Give some other people an opportunity. We had someone right here. Yes, please.
My name is Hans Luiks.
Hi.
I'm a manager of a playful learning company. We work a lot with VR, especially in the mental health. And my question is, how long are the effects of VR measurable in a RCT? The effect, how long? Is it months? Is it years? Because we struggle to get the right results over a long period of time.
So
actually, you're asking whether people will ultimately stop using fluffy toilet paper.
So the honest answer is we don't know. That being said, in my lab, it's become a requirement that when you run a study, there has to be what we call a longitudinal component where you look later on. And in the Becoming Homeless study, where we had thousands of people go through with the petition, we were funded by a foundation that demanded we answer your question. And what I can say to you is that when you do Becoming Homeless, 8 weeks later, you're still more likely to sign that petition than controls 8 weeks later. And there's been 5 or 6 other studies that have looked maybe a week out or 24 hours out and have shown that the effects last longer, say, than watching a video. That being said, for me to look you in the eye and to say it works over time, there needs to be dozens, if not hundreds of studies. So the truth is we just need more work. Yep.
Yes, please.
Can you hear me? Yeah. I'm Fabiola Dadas. I'm a doctoral candidate, and I also have a startup company that is creating virtual reality software for cognitive rehabilitation of deficits after a stroke. And you suggested that it's addictive. I want it to be addictive. Is this a bad thing? Is it a bad thing to make something that is actually beneficial for people into something addictive?
So stroke rehabilitation is, I'm heartbroken by the fact that there's not a great VR stroke rehab. So the way you rehabilitate a stroke for certain aspects of visual neglect and motor deficiency is you have to move your body in certain ways. And I've had 2 dear colleagues have strokes recently, and cutting edge at Stanford is they're doing these exercises with chalkboards, and it's such a great use case because you control what they see, you can point where they can look, they can do the same movements over and over again. So I love what you're doing, keep doing it. Your question though, which is how do we make it so people want to use VR when it's painful and drudgerous, I can tell you about a study we just published. Kids who have chronic regional pain syndrome, CRPS, you have a neurological disorder, and you have what's called an affected limb. You have a limb, it really hurts to move it. And so the way you treat it is you have them move it, unfortunately. So you have these kids who are in agony, they can't move their legs, but they need to move it to try to reduce the pain. We built a module that builds something called self-efficacy, the belief that you can do something. So what we did is for the kids, they would look down, and if they move their leg 10 degrees, in VR, we'd put a gain factor so they'd see it move 30. They'd get an advanced sense of visualization so that they believe I actually can get better and I can move the leg. And that it was 20 lines of code to do it. And that small change made it very motivating for them to want to go in and do their exercises. And what we found in the study, and I'm happy to send you the paper, was small sample of kids, so please, it's preliminary. The kids who normally would cry during their physical therapy, they would actually be smiling when they came to the lab because it was, now, the easiest thing to say and the hardest thing to do is to make VR content and video game content when it's for good to be so fun that people want to do it. This gamification, everyone says let's do it, but it's hard to do. So, lots of iteration, try hard.
Yes, please. Can you wait for the microphone, please? Hi.
Hello, my name is Michel Bahar. I was wondering if there are still new developments that they are becoming lighter because they are quite bulky, and also resolution and the weight and so on.
Yes, so currently the way most virtual reality systems work is that you wear goggles that has screens on them and they draw on the screens. In Silicon Valley, where the smart money is going is not on that strategy, but instead beaming light directly into the retina, projecting into the retina, so that you don't have to worry about the constraints of a physical screen. And one of my favorite new companies is out of Tel Aviv. They're called iWave Vision. And what they do, so your retina stores light for about 20 milliseconds, meaning if you put light on part of the retina, even if you take the light away, the retina still sees that light for 20 milliseconds. What these Israelis are doing is taking a low-intensity laser beam, very precise, small point that moves very quickly, and over your retina they're going like a dot printer, and each time it hits, it stays in the retina, so what you get is this stunningly high-resolution image right on your eyeball with really intense colors. And I let these guys do this to me. My wife was very upset that I let them do this to me. So the future is in retinal projection, and I believe the real future is in 1 pixel at a time.
And so that will maybe help the problem that most people have now with VR, that you get tired after a few minutes because your eyes are continually trying to focus on the screen, which is too close.
You get it. You get it.
So that's the solution.
If you're projecting on the retina, so if you can all do this if you want. When your finger comes closer to your eyes, 2 things happen. Your eyes converge on it, and each eye is a liquid lens that's called accommodation. In virtual reality, with most goggles, you can converge, meaning you can move your eyes when objects move in the screen, but the focal point is set by the goggle makers themselves. So you have this weird dissociation where you can converge, but you can't accommodate. And what light fields will allow you to do is they can change that focal point dynamically because there is no focal point set. So yeah, great.
Will that also help make us less dizzy, which is another of the side effects of VR?
It's in theory, no one's tested this that rigorously, but what the common talking point is the reason you can't do VR for hours is because of that dissociation. The truth is no one's tested it because it's hard to do it the right way. So we'll find out once somebody builds it well and we can test it. Although there'll probably be people still designing bad VR that puts you on roller coasters to get you dizzy. Even if you have good...
You had a great description in your book of a car salesman who put people in their car and took them on wild rides, and all these CEOs were vomiting out the window because the ride was too wild.
Yeah, it turns out if you want to impress CEOs, do not make them nauseous. That's a good rule.
I think the advice was, it was one of the guidelines in the last chapter. Yeah. Don't make your customers vomit.
No.
Yeah, it sounds like a smart idea.
You'd think.
Okay, next. Yeah. It's on.
Yeah? Okay.
Your name?
I'm Ruben Hansen. I'm a graduate from the TU Delft University of Technology. I graduated in urbanism, and I researched how you can use VR as a design tool in urban design. But what I want to ask you is, how do you see VR affecting our relationship to the built environment and to how people live, how they work, how infrastructure will be. Like in 15 years when the technique is perfect, how do you see it?
That was one of my questions too.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Sorry.
From a design standpoint, you've probably all thought of this, but there's really great use cases where you can visualize spaces before you build them. You can find out, whoa, that morning sunlight's going to look really bad. There's really great work by a woman named Elizabeth Barron from Ford Motors, where she saved the company tens of millions of dollars by finding out that when you build it, somebody who's 2 meters tall won't be able to see out of the rearview mirror, and so for testing design, I think it's good. How many of you guys have seen the movie Ready Player One yet? Okay. Ready Player One is a movie where everybody's in VR all the time, and to me the most powerful scene is the opening scene where they kind of just pan across all these windows of people living their lives normally, and everybody has the goggles on. Everybody has the goggles on, and the way they've built the homes is for the goggles, and I hope we don't get there. That's where I'm hoping we're not building to accommodate people who are doing VR as opposed to talking to people. But that's the dystopian vision of how it's going to affect design, which is,
My name is Thijs Roes. I'm a writer and producer in Amsterdam. Some people say that VR hasn't had its Super Mario moment yet, that brought it from like a niche to a mainstream. Is it more the technology that's behind or the content that's behind? And the follow-up question is, what's the most beautiful thing you've ever seen in VR?
So for the first question, yes, we don't have one application that everybody loves. where I disagree with the contention and is that we're moving too slowly. So I've been doing VR for 20 years. Literally, so Mark Zuckerberg comes to my lab in 2014 in March. We spent 2 hours together. 2 weeks later, Facebook buys Oculus for $3 billion.
That's your fault.
The New York Times runs a front page article on the business section saying it's my fault, and that's why I still have these bags under my eyes, because from that moment on, it's been just a... However, when Zuck was in my lab, there was probably 1,000 high-end goggles in the entire world. Maybe 2,000 if you want to be conservative. There are currently 15 to 20 million worldwide, probably higher than that. And I know the Silicon Valley people, they want faster progress. They want 2 billion people on VR Facebook, and they want everyone to have a smartphone. From my perspective, when I said earlier, we've only had one death in VR, and I'm surprised there hasn't been more, I don't say that lightly. I like moving a little bit slowly with this technology and making sure that we're not hurting people, ourselves, each other. And so I'm really careful with that. In terms of the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in VR, one of my favorite demos, it's now 4 years old, it was called Dumpy Goes Elephants. And in this one, it was a very simple demo. It was computer graphics and not very realistic, but you had a trunk like an elephant, and you moved your head, and the trunk just kind of moved around. And there was a simplicity to it that made me really happy. I don't know how to describe it, but...
Did you do anything with your trunk in this demo? Or?
Yeah, so they had enabled physics. So there was balls you could smash around, and you just kind of played with stuff with your trunk, and it was very rewarding.
Yeah, who's next? Okay, we have questions over here.
Hi guys, I'm Daan Kip, founder of VR Days Europe. I've only been in this industry for 5 years, and I've experienced presence 2 times. You've been in it 20 years. How often did you experience this magic feeling of presence? And can you still, after 20 years, trick yourself into feeling true presence? Because that's for me the driver to be in this industry is presence. How have you been coping with getting the same...
I think you're the right person to be building VR. If you have such a conservative standard for what is feels good in VR, I like you being the one building it, right? Because you're not going to put stuff out there that's not great. I mean, are you using full room scale tracking?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What are the 2
high
things?
Tech,
what are the 2 things that gave you presence?
One of them was the first time social VR, Oculus Touch, and then talking to each other. It was just bobbly floating heads. First time was DK1. A steampunk experience. So it doesn't really have to relate to tech, I guess. But every time you feel it, it's harder and harder to get that true, total presence, where you're just in it and you can lose yourself from time after.
You mean you're getting used to it?
Yes, definitely. I'm getting used to it.
You're getting blasé.
No, blasé is not the right word. I think it's just hard to you get used to the level of tech. And the level of content as well. And I wonder how often you've experienced it. And do you have it in your lab every time, for instance? Or don't you get used to it?
You don't sound blasé at all, Jeremy.
Well, I would say that in this gentleman's case, it's not that he got used to it, because there's only 2 times ever he's felt presence, right? So it's not like there was 30 times and then 20 times. So I run a VR lab, and I only get to do VR like twice a week. I write grants and I give talks. I never actually get to play anymore. So we can continue to talk offline. I agree that social VR certainly ramps it up a notch, and we've got a meta-analysis that shows how when you network, the physiology ramps up, but maybe you need a different field. I don't know. A different profession.
Perhaps. Better tech.
We had a question here. Yeah?
Hi.
Hi.
Very interesting listening to you. My name is Audrey Mazes, and I have a company called Expat in Amsterdam. We've been lucky enough to have had very different clients, and one of the families that we're about to take care of have had a trauma within the family, a physical one. So we are actually, it's interesting because we are together with TU Delft building a body brace, a 3-point brace right now, for her to use while sleeping, except the rest of the family also has trauma. Physically. You talked about the reaction that children have, talking about the lifting, the different degrees. What's your experience in treating family members or people that have had, several traumas in different age groups? is there something we can read about the effect that VR has on
for treating trauma, like PTSD?
Yeah, and in severe forms.
Okay. So there's two heroes in terms of the academic world I'll point you to, and both of them I interview them in chapter 6 of the book, which is called Time Machines for Trauma. The way that we treat PTSD is we tend to forget VR for a second. You need to bring the person back to the trauma so that you can give them coping strategies mentally. Turns out, though, if you've had trauma, you don't want to go back, and the brain fights it. What virtual reality does is it makes that journey easier so that you can go there. And I'll give you two examples. The first is my colleague Skip Rizzo. He is at the University of Southern California. He's built Virtual Iraq. And so for soldiers who come back with PTSD, he puts them in the goggles, always guided by a therapist, never alone, always guided by a therapist. And they go back to Iraq and they go to the spot where trauma occurred and they hear the gunfire. He's got virtual scent where he can simulate burning flesh scents and he could really bring you back. I know that sounds horrible, but it's important to get them there. And there's great data that shows that this works really well. A similar one that Tracy brought up earlier is about after 9/11. September 11th, Joanne DeFeedy, who's a professor in the med school at Cornell, the second the towers went down, got on the phone with Hunter Hoffman, and they started building a virtual reality treatment for the first responders that had to go there and be among all those bodies. And she's got great data on showing that works. So it works really well. On kids with PTSD, you can send me an email and I can actually go through my studies. There's been clinical work with VR for treating kids for things like physical rehabilitation. I don't know of anything with kids and PTSD.
Thank you.
But the best thing to do is I'll give you the names of the 5 or 6 people that do this work, and you comb their websites and send them an email.
Thanks. We have a question back here.
Hi, my name is Daniela Batus. I would like to ask, can we use VR for co-creation? So let's say people in this room in, 2-3 years, that we could collaborate and actually create some stories and experiences. And my second question is, what is your passion project as of today?
So for co-creation, I think that is one of the best use cases right now. As the gentleman pointed out, when you're with other people, VR just all of a sudden feels much better. There's something very special about seeing other people's hands and seeing where they're looking. And I think there's a lot of nice projects where people can co-create music together by moving their bodies and, of course, 3D objects. And there's, from a business standpoint, on the design side, a lot of high-end products where you can basically network Tokyo and New York City so that people are seeing the same prototype and changing it. For me, my passion project right now is, so I mentioned that I just flew from New York City where we premiered 2 VR films at the Tribeca Film Festival. One of them is called 1,000 Cut Journey. And in this piece, you become a black male and you start out as a 7-year-old boy and you experience racial discrimination. As a 7-year-old, you're in your classroom and the teacher yells at you for something you did, and the white child did something that the same thing but doesn't get yelled at. And as a 13-year-old, you get stopped by the police and you have to put your hands up and while your white friend crossed the street and that didn't happen. And then as a 30-year-old during a job interview, and it's a really hard piece. We worked on it for 2 years. My colleague, her name is Courtney Cogburn. She studies racism for a living, and so really carefully we built it with her. And it's, this is not a fun project, but it's timely in the United States. We're having a lot of problems again with racial issues, and so I'm really excited about its possibilities. But it's certainly not a fun piece.
Yes, we have a gentleman right here in the middle, or sorry. The microphone will come to you in a moment. It had already been given away, I didn't notice.
I'm Victor Roemel, I'm from the gemeente Amsterdam. I would like to ask you, in your 20 years experience, you observed...
Could you speak closer to the microphone, please?
In your 20 years experience, observed a lot of people in different situations, different contexts, when they used virtual reality. But was there something that surprised you in the way they behaved or they experienced it, what they miss in daily life when they are not using virtual reality? Could you say something about it?
So maybe the most surprising experience I ever had in virtual reality, I was giving a demo to a Russian, he was the chief financial officer of Sberbank, a very big bank in Russia. And I gave him the demo that I described, that where you become the black woman in the mirror. And so he turned around, he was a black woman, and then we bring in this guy, and the guy then starts saying some bad things about your race and your gender. And whenever I give a virtual reality demo, you'll see this when I do it, when the person's in the goggles, I'm always holding them like this because I don't want them to get hurt. After that judge dove, I didn't want to happen again. What this Russian, he was, the chief financial officer of a multi-billion-dollar company, but he's a big guy. He's a really big guy. And when he started getting the racial discrimination, he did a right cross roundhouse combo, and I ducked the punch, but I did not duck the kick, and I took it right in the side. So that was the most stunned I'd ever been in VR.
Yes, sir. Orly?
Hi, my name is Vincent Jensen. I don't have the extreme credentials of all the other speakers, but I have been following VR and AR as it started. The thing I'm wondering is there are so many senses you can fake and try to trick your brain to believing that what you're seeing is real, but there are small pieces that you are unable to hack. How do you see that going into the future? It's deep in your brain. I don't think you can fake it. It's probably also the reason why people cannot stay in it for too long, because you get nauseous, because your brain just short circuits, because it starts to realize that what you're experiencing is not real. So how do you see that last step into trying to hack that part?
So 2 answers to your question. The first is one of my heroes is a man named Jaron Lanier. He coined the term virtual reality, built the first avatar in the late 1970s. Jaron always says the best part about VR is when you take those goggles off and you see how rich and amazing the real world is. So my first answer is I'm not sure I want to get to the level where we can't discriminate it, but I do appreciate the question. And so the second answer is I want to tell you about our donut study, and this is about scent and trying to hack taste. Okay, so the big idea behind this research is imagine that you were eating a vegan patty, and it tasted and looked like the best hamburger you'd ever had in your life. We've just solved climate change because you don't have to clear the forest for the cattle, and we've reduced the obesity epidemic in the United States. So the first step in this journey, research-wise, is we ran a study, a postdoc, Benji Lee from Singapore. Everybody put the goggles on, and they were moving their arms. Everybody saw a donut in their hand, okay? And they had to bring it to their mouth and do this over and over again. Half the subjects felt a donut in their hand. We had a plastic donut. The other half did not. And half the subjects, we beamed donut scent into their nose. The other half did not. So for the experiment, everybody saw the donut, but we could test the effect of feeling it in your hand and the effect of smelling food. And what we measured later on after the study, we had a plate of donuts there, and we said, look, you just had this experience. If you want to eat some donuts, eat as many as you want. And because this was an early study, we had 2 competing hypotheses. The first was satiation, that you were going to get full from this virtual experience because you felt like you ate them, and so you wouldn't need to eat them. The second was priming, which is you were reminded of donuts and you wanted to eat more. And this is an early study, only about 100 subjects. What we demonstrated in this study was satiation. People ate less donuts later on when they'd felt the donut and when they'd smelled it compared to when they hadn't. So, but a long way to go to get to good taste.
We have a question here.
Yes, my name is Jaap Bonjer. I'm a surgeon with a special interest in surgical education. And in surgery, touch, haptic feedback is very important.
Yeah.
How far are you with haptic feedback in VR?
So using VR to train surgeons is one of the great applications that existed before this new consumer revolution, and for decades we've been doing it. I believe we probably have the world's expert in this at Stanford. His name is Ken Salisbury, and you can find him or send me an email and I'll send you his information. We still have a long way to go. Haptics VR is moving pretty slowly, but the systems we have now, given how expensive cadavers are, I still think it adds some value, and there's so many studies that have been done here. There's actually good meta-analyses that combine the data from the raw studies that I trust, and there's 2 or 3 of them that are published that are good to find about. I think it's a great use case.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
This is a good moment to go back to our doctor. Sorry, come right back to you.
Yeah, I would like to talk a little bit more about the haptics thing. How do you feel about mobile VR versus the full room scale? Should we just skip mobile VR and go into large-scale things? Or should we embrace mobile VR to make the adoption sooner because it's cheaper?
So for those that don't know, mobile VR, you have a phone, you slide it into some piece of plastic with some lenses, and you can just look around. If you walk, nothing changes. So it's meant to be what's called 3 degrees of freedom or rotation only. You just turn your head. Room scale VR is when you have tracking cameras and you can walk around and the scene updates. And I think that in general, when we're trying to solve a problem, so when I talk to, I just spent the last 2 days talking to business people who are, using VR for their products, and my number one piece of advice is first start with a problem that needs to be solved, and then we figure out the right medium to answer that problem. And you know what? Rotation only, training those quarterbacks to recognize a defense, all they need to do is look around, and that works perfectly. For other things, for training, the German national soccer team, soccer players need to move a little bit, right? That's a little different than the quarterback who starts standing still, and the applications change. So in general, if you want to produce fun, compelling VR, moving is always good. So I just wrote a piece for Wired that reviews all the studies that show that body movements contribute to this overall feeling of presence. And in fact, we're about to publish an academic paper in a journal called Computers in Education with a very large sample. If you're trying to predict if a student learns while in VR, you can look at the amount of body movement, and that actually can predict movement. So in general, movement is great. However, the answer to your question is more nuanced, because I think we need to find out what the problem is and then choose the solution, because it's so easy to do mobile.
For VR,
yeah.
But I think as soon as you have the goggles and everybody can buy them, there would also be advertisers bringing all the negativism in.
Yeah.
You're talking about the donuts. You don't need to eat it in order to smell it and whatever. But then I think Dunkin' Donuts might use it, put their logo on top of it, and you will eat 3 of them.
Yeah.
Would you avoid that, or what is your position on that?
Well, so my position as a person who, I advise a lot of the tech companies as we're going into VR, and what I tell them, and they may or may not listen, the mistake we made with social media, we being the Valley, not me, but I'll take a tiny bit of blame just because I live there, is we decided to make all these products free. Social media is free. Therefore, the only way to make the models work is by selling ads. So let's make people pay for the great experiences in VR, and then we don't have to sell ads, is one answer to your question. But I'm of the opinion, if you're getting this amazing thing for free, I don't know how many of you guys use social media, I personally don't. If you're using this awesome free product, you're going to get ads. Deal with it. That's I don't know what else to say. The model fundamentally needs to change. But of course they're going to do ads. And so here, I'll make it even, this is longer. There's things that are even creepier that one can do in VR than just show you an ad. And it has to do with machine learning and your body movements. I've got a piece that I'm going to publish in the Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA, Journal of the American Medical Association, pretty soon about this exact thing. So. Yep, but...
About Dunkin' Donuts?
About Dunkin' Donuts. And zombies.
Jeremy, in your book you say that most people in the future will not only become VR consumers, but also VR producers. What is that going to look like?
Look, if you would have told any of us in this room that 10 years ago, anyone can shoot a quick video and later on millions of people could see it, we'd say you're lying. And I'm not sure what it looks like, but if we're going to follow the trend of how media is working, That's how it's going to work. The cameras, when we first started doing the quarterback training and then the soccer player training, the rig to capture what's called spherical video cost, about $3,000, $4,000 US, and to operate it, you need an engineer. Now Samsung sells one for $300, Theta sells one for $80, and you can upload it right to Google 360. So you're already at the point where anybody can make it. The problem is that no one's really consuming it, so no one's bothering to make it. But there's
is there VR porn yet?
There is, and apparently they made $97 million last year. I did some research before coming today. I've never seen it, and I don't say this to be a prude. It's most of my colleagues. It's just not something that a lot of us have seen. So somebody's using it to make money. I'm not sure that given the main activity people do when they're using pornography, the fact that you can't tell if someone else comes in the room is probably not a great use case.
There are limitations.
There are limitations.
I'm curious.
And I've never said that on stage before, so you're a good interviewer.
I'm curious about the shifting boundaries between science and commerce, because you wrote that you moved from UC Santa Barbara in the late 90s when VR was only a research tool for scientists. You went to Stanford, you switched to a communication department, and then around 2010 you really started to see a change. Your first child was born, which maybe made you look at the world differently. And VR started transforming into next generation consumer technology. I'm curious, your first child is now 7?
Just about.
Maybe 7?
Just about.
What role will VR play in his life when he reaches the age you are now? And then we'll get back to the science and commerce.
I have 2 girls. One is 6.5, one is 4. The 6-year-old has done VR 5 times in her life, never more than 2 minutes. I brought it to her classroom and I gave demos to all the students. The 4-year-old has done it once. And, what role it will play in her life in a good way is going to be field trips. So field trips, we all take field trips, and I want those to continue. I don't want to get rid of the physical field trips, but I want to have a field trip every day. Right? Why should we ever learn about a statue from a slide again or from a book? And so I think for kids, there's really nice use cases of putting in a classroom for field trips, and that's a good case. But again, it's 3 minutes is enough. Like how long do you need to stare at the statue of David? Right? Maybe it's hours, but a few minutes is enough.
And can you tell us something about how you see the shifting fields of science and commerce? There's still, I'm sure, a lot for science to do.
Yeah.
You've mentioned that several times this evening, but commerce is really catching up.
Yeah, this is being a professor in Silicon Valley is challenging because it's very hard to not spend time with these amazing companies, and I'm not of the ilk. It's very easy for journalists now to say that Facebook is evil and Google's evil and Samsung's evil, and I don't believe that, and I know a lot of these people. I think we as a community have made some mistakes, but one of the challenges, to get back to your question, is in resisting the temptation to just send this stuff out. So in other words, let me give you a very tangible example. The piece we premiered at Tribeca just 5 days ago. It just came out, 1,000 Cut Journey. That's where you become black. It's really intense. A decent proportion of people that do it come out with tears in their eyes, and people of color, it's a trigger, whereas those that have gone through this experience. So we have to be really slow and careful, and we are not putting this one up on Steam or Vive for quite some time because we're going to study it. However, given what's happened, have you guys, did the news from Starbucks make it out here? There's a lot of, nothing against Starbucks, there's a lot of instances of, people making mistakes, and from the corporate side, people want this.
Tell about Starbucks for those who might have missed the news.
There are many instances with many companies and many government institutions of whites and blacks being treated differently. In Philadelphia, about 9-10 days ago, 2 black males were arrested for sitting at Starbucks. And that's about the story. And because
they didn't buy anything.
Well, let's leave the because out. Let's just leave it because they were just arrested for being black, and because many whites
Something
go in
like
there.
black while driving.
Yes. But that's not. I don't want to pick on Starbucks because that got a lot of media, but it happens all the time. And so this piece is there are many CEOs from companies as big as, if not bigger than Starbucks, that are asking me, Jeremy, can we have this now? And my answer, it's tempting to, you're in the valley, like, get it out there, let's do it, disrupt. And I just want to be a little slow and careful. Because we have run a study, by the way. So one of my heroes, my academic heroes, is a guy named Mel Slater. He works at the University of Barcelona, and he's published a lot of studies showing VR can reduce racism when you wear a black body, and some of our studies have shown the same. However, there is a phenomenon called priming, which is that when you get reminded of stuff, you form associations. And in the United States, a number of studies have shown that when you show people black faces, you show white people black faces, they think about violence. So my colleague Jennifer Eberhardt at Stanford, she's run a study that shows that if you subliminally flash a black face to white people, they're quicker to recognize a gun in a room, that the association of blacks and violence, and she's a MacArthur Genius Award winner, so she's one of the best scholars around. We ran a study where people became black in VR, whites became black in VR, and not every time, because I love Mel's work, and his work is probably more conclusive than this one study. Whites became more racist when they wore black bodies because they were reminded of these associations that they have stored in their brain. So we want to be slow and careful on this one. And one of the challenges of commerce, really getting involved in science now is that it's tempting to just send it out. But sometimes you got to be careful.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I'm going to do some closing remarks now, but first let's have a really big applause for Jeremy.
Stay here.
Thank you for joining us this evening. Thanks to our partner in this event, the fantastic venue Pakhuis de Zwijger. Thanks to bookstore Atheneum, who's downstairs selling Jeremy's books. You saw them when you came in, and he'll be happy to sign for you downstairs next to the entrance. The mission of the John Adams Institute is to bring the best and the brightest of American thinking to the Netherlands. If you want to keep up to date on what we do, sign up for our newsletter on www.john-adams.nl. Coming soon to you too on May 5th, we're doing an event that promises to be really special with Film Institute about the Vietnam War on May 5th. May 24th, another speaker in our technology series, the internet critic Andrew Keen. And speaking of homelessness, Jeremy, how timely, on July 4th, Independence Day, we have a sociologist from Princeton named Matt Desmond coming to speak at the John Adams, who wrote a book called Evicted about the rage of homelessness that is sweeping over the U.S. Thank you for joining us. Let's go downstairs, buy the book, and have a beer together. Thanks so much.
It's very rare. Yeah, it's very rare. So great questions, great thoughts. I appreciate it.